The king's dreams. The chief wine waiter had promised Joseph that he would remember him to the king. But the waiter forgot all about his friend. A couple of years later, the king had two strange dreams, and no one could explain their meaning. Then the waiter remembered Joseph and told the king all about him. So Joseph was released from prison and brought before the king. In my first dream, 7 thin cows ate up 7 fat cows, said the king. In the second, 7 thin ears of grain ate up 7 ripe ears. Joseph explained the meaning of the dreams. God is warning you that there will be 7 years of good harvests, followed by 7 years of bad harvests, he said. The famine in Egypt. Joseph gave the king some good advice. Store up the crops during the 7 years of plenty, so there is enough to go around when the harvest fails. The king thought for a moment. You are a wise man, he said. I shall make you my prime minister, and then you can put your plans into action. Everything happened just as Joseph said it would. For the next 7 years, storehouses were filled with grain, but then the crops stopped growing, and famine struck. Joseph made sure all the grain that had been saved was shared among the people. The brothers go to Egypt. Jacob and his sons were also affected by the famine. So the brothers traveled to Egypt to buy food. Jacob kept his youngest son, Benjamin, at home. When the brothers came before Joseph, they did not recognize him, but Joseph knew who they were. He wanted to find out what kind of men they had become, so he decided to test them. You're spies, he said. No, we're not, they protested. Prove your story by bringing your brother back here, ordered Joseph. I'll keep one of you prisoner. The missing cup. Jacob did not want Benjamin to go to Egypt, but he had no choice. When the brothers arrived in Egypt, Joseph gave them all the food they needed. The brothers thanked Joseph and started out on their journey home. But, unknown to them, Joseph had planted a silver cup in Benjamin's sack. They had not traveled far when Joseph's servant stopped them. Who has stolen my master's silver cup? He demanded. The cup was found in Benjamin's sack. The brothers were taken before Joseph. Judah pleaded for Benjamin. Punish me instead, he begged. Now Joseph knew his brothers had changed for the better. I am Joseph, your long-lost brother, he cried. The family is reunited. Joseph's brothers were afraid because they had treated Joseph so badly. But Joseph told them not to worry. It was God's plan that I should come to Egypt, he said. Go home and bring our father back with you. Jacob could not believe his ears when his sons told him the wonderful news. They packed up their things and set off for Egypt. Joseph came riding out in a royal chariot to greet them. He flung his arms around his father, and both men wept for joy. Exodus, life in Egypt. The king of Egypt was worried because there were so many of God's people, known as Israelites, living in his country. He thought that they might form an army to fight against the Egyptians. The king wanted to make sure that this would never happen, so he forced the Israelites to work for him as slaves. He treated them badly and made their lives miserable. But no matter how hard he made them work, their numbers continued to grow and grow. So many babies were born that the king began to panic. Throw all the newborn babies into the Nile River. All the newborn baby boys, throw them into the Nile River, he ordered. Baby Moses. A woman had a baby son. and she knew he would be killed if she did not do something to save him. So she made a reed basket and hid him inside. Carefully, she placed the basket in the Nile River. Her older daughter watched from a distance. When the royal princess came to bathe in the river, she found the basket. The baby's sister ran up to the princess. "Let me find a nurse to look after this child for you," she said. Then she got her mother. The baby was cared for by his own mother until he was old enough to live at the palace. The princess adopted him and named him Moses. Moses kills a man. Moses grew up in the palace and was treated like a prince, but he was very sad to see the Israelites slaving away for their Egyptian masters. He knew that he was one of God's people, despite all his fine Egyptian clothes. One day, Moses saw an Egyptian beating a slave, and this threw him into a rage. He killed the Egyptian, then hid his body in the sand. When the king heard what his adopted grandson had done, he was furious and tried to kill Moses. But Moses escaped from the palace and went to live in a country called Midian. Moses marries Zipporah. One day, Moses was sitting alone by a well. He thought sadly about the past and wondered what the future might hold. Then 7 sisters came to the well and began to draw water for their sheep. Soon, some shepherds arrived and pushed the sisters out of the way. But Moses helped the women and made sure they got all the water they needed. The sisters told their father what had happened. He was a priest named Jethro, and he invited Moses to live with them. Jethro gave Zipporah, one of his daughters, to Moses as a wife. The burning bush. Moses worked as a shepherd for many years, taking care of the family's flocks. One day, Moses led his sheep to graze on the lower slopes of Mount Sinai. He looked up and saw a strange sight. A bush was on fire, but it did not seem to be burning up in the flames. Suddenly, a voice spoke from the bush. Moses realized it was God's voice. God told Moses that he had seen how unhappy his people were in Egypt. "I am going to rescue my people," said God. "I want you, Moses, to lead them out of Egypt and take them to the beautiful land of Canaan."
Moses listens to God. Moses was surprised that God had chosen him for such an important task. "Why have you picked me to lead your people?" he asked. "I'm not special. I don't think anyone will follow me anywhere." God promised to help Moses, but Moses was still uncertain. "Your brother Aaron will work with you," said God. "I will give you the power to perform miracles, and I will give Aaron the right words to speak to my people." So Moses agreed to return to Egypt and do what God had asked. The king of Egypt. Moses and Aaron traveled to Egypt, where they met all the leaders of God's people. Aaron told them about God's promise of freedom. The leaders were happy to hear the news and thanked God for his goodness. Then Moses and Aaron went to the king to try to persuade him to let the Israelites leave Egypt. But the king became very angry when he heard their request. "Your people are just lazy," he shouted. "Now I will make them work even harder. I will never let them go." So God's people became even more miserable than before. The plagues. God told Moses that he had not forgotten his promise to free his people. But when Moses and Aaron went back to the palace to talk to the king, he still refused to let the Israelites go. So God turned the waters of the Nile River into blood. But the king would not change his mind. Each time the king refused God's request, God sent a different disaster upon the people of Egypt. Their homes were filled with frogs and huge swarms of gnats and flies. Their animals died, and the Egyptians themselves broke out into painful rashes. Then a heavy hailstorm flattened their farms, but the king remained as stubborn as ever. Moses warns the king. God had not finished with the people of Egypt. He sent an army of locusts to eat their crops. Then he plunged the country into darkness for 3 days. God kept his own people safe from all of these troubles. In spite of everything, the king still would not let the Israelites leave Egypt. Moses and Aaron went to see the king one last time. Unless you let the Israelites go, God will send the most terrible punishment of all upon the Egyptians, warned Moses. At midnight, the eldest son in every Egyptian home will die. But the king refused to let the Israelites go. The final punishment. God promised to keep his people safe from the final disaster. Moses gave instructions so that every family knew how to protect themselves. Every man had to kill his best lamb or goat and paint its blood over the doors and doorposts of the house. This was to make sure that the angel of death would pass over their homes. Then a special meal was prepared for the whole family to eat that evening. Just as God had said would happen, the firstborn son in every Egyptian family died that night, but God's people were saved. A change of heart. At long last, the king agreed to let Moses lead the Israelites out of Egypt. There was a great excitement as they began their journey. But in spite of everything that had happened, the king soon began to wish he had not let them go. Who would do the hard work now that his slaves had gone? The king sent his soldiers after the Israelites to bring them back to Egypt. The soldiers caught up with them as they were camping by the Red Sea. God's people were trapped. Moses told them not to panic because God had promised to protect them. Crossing the Red Sea. God told Moses to hold his wooden stick out towards the Red Sea. The crowd watched in astonishment as the waves parted, leaving a path through the waters. Moses led his people across to the other side. The Egyptian soldiers tried to follow them, but the wheels of their chariots got stuck in the sand. Soon the waves crashed back, drowning the whole army. God looked after his people on their long journey to the new land he had promised them. By day, they were always guided by a tall cloud just ahead of them. Every night, a column of fire showed them God was there. Bitter water. Moses led God's people through the desert. They walked for 3 days without finding anything to drink. At long last, they stumbled upon a place where there was water, but it tasted horrible. The people cried out in despair, and Moses asked God to help them. God showed Moses a piece of wood and told him to throw it in the water. Moses obeyed God, and soon after, the water was sweet enough to drink. Then God promised his people that if they obeyed him, he would always take care of them. Quails and manna. Every day in the desert was hot and tiring, and it wasn't long before God's people began to complain. "We were better off in Egypt. At least we weren't hungry there," they moaned. God heard what they were saying and told Moses he would give his people all the food they needed. That evening, a flock of quails settled on the camp. Everyone had plenty of meat to eat. The next morning, the ground was covered with white flakes that tasted sweet, like cookies. Again, there was enough for everyone. The people called the white food manna. They ate manna for the rest of their long journey. Water from the rock. God's people grumbled a lot on their travels. They found it difficult to believe that God would take care of them. One day, they stopped at a place where there was no water to drink. They were hot and very thirsty. "Why did you bring us here? To die of thirst?" they complained to Moses. Some of the people were so angry that they picked up stones to throw at their leader. God told Moses to take his special stick and hit a rock with it. Moses did as he was asked, and water began to flow out of the rock. Soon there was enough water to drink for everyone. Jethro helps Moses. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came to visit Moses in the desert. Both men were very happy to see each other again. Moses told Jethro about all the wonderful things God had done for his people. Jethro praised God for his great goodness. During his stay, Jethro watched Moses at work. Moses spent every day helping God's people settle their arguments. "Choose some helpers to share this huge task with you," suggested Jethro. "It's too much hard work for one person." Moses was not too proud to listen to advice. He chose a team of wise people to help him guide and teach God's people.
God speaks to Moses. Several months later, God's people arrived at Mount Sinai. Moses climbed the holy mountain to pray. God told Moses he was going to speak to him in front of the people to show them that Moses really was his chosen leader. So the people gathered at the bottom of the mountain. Suddenly, the cloud covering the peak of the mountain changed to fiery smoke, and the ground shook and thunder rumbled. When the people heard God's voice, they were frightened. God said that only Moses could go up to the mountain to talk to him. So Moses climbed the holy mountain. The 10 Commandments. God wanted his people to love him and each other, so he gave special laws to Moses. These laws were called the 10 Commandments. The laws told the people how to behave. They must not worship other gods or make images of them. They must respect God's name and always obey their parents. They must not kill, steal another's husband or wife, or take something that belonged to someone else. They must not tell lies or be jealous of anything, and they must rest on the 7th day of the week. If God's people kept these laws, they would live good and happy lives. The golden calf. Moses spent days talking to God at the top of Mount Sinai. He was gone for so long that the people became impatient. "We need a God to lead us now," they said to Aaron. Aaron told the people to bring him their gold. They did so, and Aaron melted it down to make a statue of a calf. The people worshipped the statue and danced around it. Moses came down from the mountain carrying 2 stone slabs with him. God's commandments written on them. He was so angry at what he saw that he dropped the stone slabs, smashing them into pieces. God forgives his people. Moses was furious with Aaron. He had let all this happen while he was away. "I will ask God to forgive you," he said to his people. So once again, Moses climbed Mount Sinai to talk to God. Trembling with fear, Moses asked God to help him lead his stubborn and sinful people. God was angry with the people, but pleased with his servant Moses. God promised Moses that he would give his people a second chance. "I will never leave my people if they trust and obey me," said God. A special tent. God's people were always on the move, so they couldn't build a temple in one place to worship God. But they still needed somewhere special to go to pray. "Make a big tent especially for me," God told Moses. "Use all the best materials. Everybody who wants to can bring gifts to help with the work." When the tent is finished, you can take it with you on your journey. God's people wanted to make the tent as beautiful as possible. They gave fine linen, animal skins, gold, silver, and many other precious things. In the end, Moses had to stop the people from bringing presents because there was more than enough to make God's tent. The Promised Land. At last, the people came within sight of Canaan, the Promised Land. So Moses chose 12 men, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, to go and discover all they could about Canaan. They were gone for 6 weeks and returned with delicious fruits. But the news they brought back was not good. "This beautiful land will never be ours," they replied. "The people are powerful, and we will not be able to take over their strong cities." God's people are unhappy. Yet again, God's people were unhappy. "Why did we ever leave Egypt?" they grumbled. One of the 12 men, a man called Caleb, spoke to the crowd. "We must trust in God. Let's get ready to go into the Promised Land," he said. His friend Joshua agreed with this, but the people were in no mood to listen. They threatened to kill Joshua and Caleb. This made God angry, and he said to Moses, "These people will wander in the desert for 40 years. They will never set foot in Canaan, but their children will enter the Promised Land led by Joshua and Caleb." God's promise. God never left his people throughout their long, difficult journey. There were many times when the people made God sad and angry, but there was not a single moment when God stopped caring for his people. During all of the years on the move, God made sure his people had food, drink, clothing, and shelter. Above all else, God wanted his people to know he was the Lord, their God. He made a solemn promise, which he called his covenant. He promised he would always look after his people in the future, just as he had done in the past. In return, God wanted his people to love and obey him.